All right, we're going to be building a REST API in PHP. We'll have a number of endpoints to create a to-do list application, read them all, sending an HTTP GET request to get all the to-do list items, and updating them, creating new ones, and deleting a to-do list item. Right? So here we create a new to-do list item by sending an HTTP post request to the create.php endpoint and create it. And here we send an HTTP GET request to get and read all the to-do list items. So we've got two. And here we can also read one. So send an HTTP GET request passing the ID as a query parameter, and we're getting the details of one of our to-do list items. All right, so send another one, another ID. We got the details. We can also update by sending a put request to the update.php endpoint, passing an ID, and then done as true. So we can mark one as true. We're sending JSON in the body request. So we send that and it was updated. All right. So if I go back to get read all or read one particular one by passing the ID, we can see that now done equals 1. That means it's marked as done. All right. We can also delete one. All right. By sending an HTTP delete request. We select the delete method to the delete endpoint and we send one. So we pass the ID in the body and we deleted one. Right. So now if I go back to read all, that one was deleted. All right. So we'll be looking at how to build this API, this REST API in PHP. So we'll have this operation post get and get for read, and also put for update, and delete for sending an HTTP delete request to delete a to-do list item. Right? So let's take a look at how to implement this. So first thing, we assuming that you do not have a PHP installation, so we will download PHP. So here I have a Windows machine, so I'm gonna select download, selecting the x64 thread save, download the zip file, and then I will be extracting it. So I will be extracting this under C. That will just make it easy for me to find it and link to it. So just name it C PHP and then extract it there. All right, so I have PHP installed here under C PHP, and then I'm going to be linking the PHP command to my environment variable. Right, so we're setting an environment variable. So search for environment variable and then click on edit environment variable, and then select the path under user variables and then edit. All right, so we're going to click on new. And then I'm going to add the path to PHP installation to my path. So C PHP, and then save it. Right. So now if I go to PowerShell, close things up, and then open PowerShell again. So if I do PHP -- version, then I should be getting PHP version, so 8.2.6, right? So next we're going to install MariaDB. So head over to mariadb.com and then go to the community database SQL server. So download the community server, select your operating system. So let's look for Windows here, and then click on download. Right, so we downloaded that. So we need to run the binary. So click on install, and then here you need to set your root password, right? It's very important that you remember this password that we will use to log into the database server. So I'm gonna be setting a password here, and it's installed on a C program files MariaDB, right? So check this, you use UTF-8 as the default server's character set, and then next, leave this as default. So 3306 is the default port, and then install MariaDB. Right, so let's get this a few seconds. Once the installation is complete, we need to do the same thing that we did with PHP. We need to add MariaDB MySQL command to the path, right? So click on finish, or it could be added. Let's take a look, right? So it's installed under C program files and MariaDB 10.11, right? So this is the bin. I want to copy the path to the bin folder. So C program files MariaDB, copy this path, and then I want to add it to my path environment variable, right? So let's go to edit environment variables, path, and then edit, and then add another one for MariaDB. All right, so let's put that bin directory that contains the binary executable programs that we can run from the command line, PowerShell. Close this thing again so we can reload the path, and let's give it a try. So MySQL -u for the user, root, and then -p, and that password that we put in when we installed MariaDB, right? So we were able to log in, so we are all ready to go. Right, so it looks like we're all set with installing PHP and MariaDB, right? So let's create a directory for our project. So we'll be writing the server code here. So I will be heading over here, and I have a db.sql file, right? So let's open this up in VS Code. So here we have it. So this is the SQL commands that will initialize our database, right? So create a database, use the database, and then create a table called tasks. We give it an ID, auto increment, with the task, the name of the to-do list task, and then date added, date time, and then done, which is boolean, default to false, and then the primary key is that auto increment ID. And then we have 3 to-do list items that will be inserted. So let's copy this whole thing and then paste it over into the MySQL client. All right, so this is the database client that will talk to the database server. We logged in as root. So let me paste these commands, and great. So no errors. Cool. So let me clear screen, or just show tables. Now we see the table tasks, and then I can describe the table to see its structure. Good. I can select star from tasks, and we see the 3 to-do list items that were initialized when we created the database. All right, cool. So we got our database ready. So next is we need to create the structure for our program. So I'm going to create a folder called config, and then I'm going to move that SQL file into the config directory, right? Just to keep things organized. And next is create a DB directory. and another directory for the models, and so we have db config models, and then another one for our API. Right. So we have one, so we go to the DB, and then I'm going to create a PHP script called database. This will contain the database class that makes connection to the database, so database.php. All right. So let's write some PHP code here. So PHP tag for the script, you don't need to close it. So class database, and then we're gonna put our attributes and fields for the database host, port, and name, and also the database username and password. All right, we also need one to hold the database connection. Right, and again, then we're going to declare a constructor. So the constructor will basically initialize the read the database credentials, and then initialize the database credentials by reading them from the environment variables. All right. So it's very important that we store these credentials in the environment, not in the source code, hard coded, so no one can see them, right? So it's always good practice to keep things in the environment. So to read things from the environment, we need to use the getinf and then give it the name of the environment variable, right? So this is anything you can declare. Getinf db host for the database host, and then port for the environment variable that will contain the port number, and then another environment variable for the database name. We'll do the same for username. All right. So db underscore username, and then password, right? So getinf. So this needs to be set in the PowerShell command line, right? You need to set these variables with the values of the credentials to make connection to the database, right? So we check if any of these are not set. So let's say you forgot to set those, then we are going to die. No, we're not going to die. We are going to let the program die with an error message that says you cannot proceed because we cannot make a connection to the database because we do not have these credentials, right? So if any of these not set, we're going to kill the program. So you can use exit or die, both will do the same. And then I'm going to say, please set database credentials as environment variables. All right. So here we declare a function for making the connection. So we try this db connection equals new PDO. So you're going to be using PDO to make the connection. And then we specify the driver, MySQL. And then the host, we concatenate it with the host. And then we also concatenate it with the port number. And the database name. So db name, concatenate with the database name. And then we don't need to concatenate anything else. We put a comma, and then we pass the username and password, right? This is just how you make a connection to a database using PDO, right? So we pass those. So next we need to set the error handling strategy. So set attribute on the DB connection, PDO, and then give it the constant attribute error mode, and then error mode exception. Alright, this is just to see the error, if there is any database connection error. And then here we catch any thrown exception. So basically we cannot proceed. So we put an error message that will end and exit the program, connection error. And then we're going to print out the error message if there's any error due to connecting to the database. And then we return the DB connection object, right? So that's how you make the database connection. Next, we go to the model. So we're gonna create a model for our to-do. So let's open the PHP tag. No need to close it, and then create a class for to-do. And then we put all the fields that we expect for the to-do item, right? So ID, task, and then date added, and then done, right? So set it to false, the default. And then we need to make a connection to the database. So DB connection. And then we will create a variable for the database table, so we can reuse it over and over. And then we create a constructor, and then in the constructor we're going to take a DB connection and then initialize our global instance variable, right? So DB connection equal DB connection. We set it there, and now we need to create our getters and setters, right? So get ID, we return the ID, and then another one for the task. We return the task. Remember, use the arrow when you want to access that instance variable. And then another one for get date added. Return it. And then another one for done. So get done, and then we return this arrow done, right? And now we declare our setters. So set the ID, pass an ID, and then set our instance variables, right? So we set the ID, and then we do the same for the task. All right, and then we set the date added. And then finally we set the done. Right, so we set done. So this is, we're done with the getters and setters. Right, next we need to write our function to create a to-do list item. So public function create, and then we put the SQL query to create a to-do list item. So it's insert into, and then we concatenate it with the DB table, and then we specify the field from our database, right? So we concatenate that with the field. So it's task, date underscore added. These are the column names in our database, and then values, and then we want to bind the task name. So this will be dynamic value, and then now the current date, and then false for the default done. All right. Next we need to bind create a prepare statement, and then bind the parameter. So this DB connection prepare. So this will create a SQL prepare statement, and then we bind the parameter. Again, the parameter is colon task name, so we want to bind it to this task name, right? So the task, and then we execute this statement, and if it doesn't return any falsy value, we return true. And then if it doesn't, then if it does return an error, then we print out the error message, right? So this will return plain text to the caller, and then we return false. Right? So so this is how you create a to-do list item. How to create the prepare statement, bind it, and then execute it, right? So let's move into the read one. So this will read a single to-do list item. So you write the query. So it's select star from, and then concatenate it with the DB table. Make sure you leave a space after from, since this will be a string. Concatenate it with another, you need to leave another space where ID, and then we're going to bind the ID to the this instance variable ID. All right, so let's create, so this is looking good. Let's create a prepare statement. So statement, and then this DB, we need to pass the DB connection, and then we call prepare on the DB connection variable, right? So next we bind the ID. So statement bind parameter colon ID to this ID, right? So bind it to the instance variable, and then we will execute it and check the row count, how many rows will return. So we can call statement row count when I make sure it's more than 1. Sorry, this is 1, has to be 1, and then we fetch. We need to fetch object, so we're gonna get an object into the result. So we'll do mapping that fetch result into an object. So we call this ID equal result ID, and then we set the task to the result task that's coming from the row, and then we do the same for the date added, and then we will do, let me fix this one task, and then done, we map it to the done value that's returned to us from the row, right? And then we return true. Otherwise we return false. We couldn't find that to-do list by the ID, so return false, right? So let's move on to the read all. So in read all, we'll do pretty much similarly. The only difference, we're not binding to a parameter. So let's concatenate select star from table name where done equals false, right? So these are only the unfinished to-do list items. So let's create our statement. This DB connection prepare statement. So this will create a prepared statement on that SQL query, and then we will execute it, right? And then we will check the row count, making sure it's more than 0. So that's statement row count, and then we return true, right? If that's the case. All right, so that's how you do read all. Next is we need to write the update function. So put out, let's make our SQL update statement, update, and then you have followed by the database table name, set, and then we want to set the done to a variable at runtime where ID equals ID. So we need to create a prepare statement. So this DB connection prepare, pass the query, and then we need to bind 2 parameters, done and ID. All right, so statement bind param, and then we tell it the name of the parameter, so colon done with this done, right? And then we'll do the same for the ID. So bind param and then colon ID, and then this ID, the instance variable ID. All right, so here we check if we can execute it. So if it was executed, we'll check the row count, making sure it's only 1 because only giving the ID. and then we return true, and then we return false otherwise. All right, lastly, delete will be pretty much similar. We only need to bind the ID, so we delete by the ID. So let's write the SQL query, delete from followed by the table name. So we concatenate this table name as db table, and then concatenate with where ID colon ID, right? So we want to delete by a to-do list item by its ID. So I'm going to copy those, prepare statement, and then execute. Right, so we bind the ID, execute, check that we deleted one, and then return true, otherwise false. Right, so let's format this guy, and we're done. Right, so let's move on to the API endpoints. So under API, create a create.php, and let's just create them all. So create.php and readOne.php, and then add another one for readAll.php to retrieve all to-do list items, and then add another script for updating a single to-do list item, so update.php, and then delete.php. So these are the API endpoints that we will handle the deletion, addition, reading, and updating for our CRUD API. So let's write the create HTTP request. So we're going to check the HTTP request method that we received. We're making sure that we only receive the HTTP get. So not equals post. Sorry, for creating a to-do list item, it has to be post. So we set, if we receive a request that is not HTTP post method, then we will set this header, return the response header, allow post, and then we send an error status code with 405. This method is not allowed, so method not allowed. Right, so in order to create a to-do list item, you must send an HTTP post request, not get, not anything else. Right, so let's set the HTTP response header. So that one was for checking the request headers. Now the response headers. So this is the response that's coming from the server, and we'll go to the client. So this is for course, right? So that way we can accept from any client. So we're going to set the access control allows origin star, and then we set the content type application JSON. We're going to return JSON to the client, and then we're going to set access control allow methods post, right? And next we need to import the model and the database connection. So this will include once the database connection, and then include once to the model, right? So next is we need to instantiate our database object, right? So database equal new database, and then db connection equals database connect. So you're gonna call that connect method in the database class to make the database connection, right? Next we need to instantiate our to-do object. We pass the db connection to the constructor of the to-do model. So passing the database connection, and next is we need to read the HTTP post request JSON body. Remember, in order to create a to-do list item, you have to send the content, the data, in the HTTP JSON body, right? In the post body. So we're gonna decode it. It's coming to us in text. So this is how to decode it in PHP. So you call JSON decode and file get contents PHP input. This will read it into an array. So we check if we received a body in the HTTP post request, and making sure that it has task, right? Remember, we need the to-do list task name to create it, right? So we want to make sure that if no task is included in the JSON body, then we're gonna send them. Let's send them 422, right? And then we'll say error missing required parameter, right? So echo JSON back to them. So just JSON encode, we convert this array message equals and then error missing required parameter task in the JSON body. All right. So we send them JSON, we send them an error 422. We have to return so we don't continue processing this request. So these are all error handling, setting request. We have not created anything yet. So let's send also JSON here. We just want to make things consistent, so we're not sending plain text. So let's send JSON in the error message. All right. So so let's move on and create our to-do list. So we need to set the task. All right. So remember, create the to-do list object. We instantiate an object of our model class. So set task, and then we pass the task name, right? And then we need to create the to-do list item, right? So here we created a to-do list item. We set the task name, and then we call the create method inside the model class, right? Remember, this is the create, and it will return true if it was created, false if it was not created. So that's why we check here. If it was successful, then we will return JSON to the client. So we're gonna return JSON message a to-do item was created. All right. So let's do else. If it wasn't created for whatever reason, we're gonna send also JSON to the caller, and still 200 because as it has not failed, did not crash. The request was successful, but it wasn't processed, right? So still return 200 here. So error, no to-do item was created. All right. So things are moving smooth here for the create. So this is the HTTP create. So let's test it. So we need to create, so we need to run the PHP server. So I am in the same directory, and I see the API config. All right. So we run the server. So PHP comes with a pre-built default server. So PHP -s localhost port 3000. So let's run it in Postman. So you need to download Postman if you do not have it. It really it will make your life easier when you work with APIs. So this is already here, localhost colon 3000 API create.php. So this is the name, the full URL to the endpoint. And then we need to pass the to-do list item inside the JSON, inside the body as raw JSON. So select JSON. So task workout, just the task name as JSON. And then we need to send it, right? So the server is running here. So I need to select star from, so let's show the table, tasks, the table name. So select star from tasks. That way we can see before we create a to-do list items, we only have 3. Workout, what are the plans, and then call mom. So these are 3 to-do list items. So let's go back to Postman, and then change this because we already have workout. So let's put do homework. right? So let's send an HTTP post request. And we got an error. Please set database credentials as environment variables. All right, so we forgot to set the database credentials. So in order to set the database credentials, you need to kill the server, Control C, and we need to set them here in the environment. So if you go to the database PHP, you see all these environment variables. They need to be set as environment variables in the shell, right? So you go to PowerShell, and to set environment variables in Windows, we use env, $env, and then followed by colon, and then the environment variable name. Right? So set the database host, and then $env colon db underscore port. It's an integer, so we need to put double quotation or single quotations here. So 3003 3306, and then environment variables for db database name. So equals to do underscore db, and then env colon db username, and the username is root, and the secret password, right? So db password, and I'm gonna put just change me. All right, so we set all the environment variables. We need to rerun the server, so that error message should disappear, right? So php -s localhost 3000 is the port that we're listening on, and let's go back to Postman and let's hope for 200. So let's send the HTTP post again. Connection error, could not find driver. All right, so that means it could not find the PHP init configuration file in the driver. So if I go back to the C directory where we installed PHP, then scroll down and you will see that we have PHP any dash development, and there is production. So let's right click on this development, PHP dash any dash development, and search for PDO underscore MySQL. So we need to enable the driver that allows MySQL to communicate with to allow PHP to communicate with the database MySQL driver. Right, so this is the PDO MySQL driver. So remove the semicolon. Again, it's line 944. Just remove the semicolon. Semicolon is like a comment, so uncomment that. And let me just search if there's anything needs to be commented, uncommented. So it looks good. So just remove the semicolon before that extension name and save it. And do I need to kill this? So I will kill the server, Control C, and run it again and head over to Postman. So let's send an HTTP post. Getting connection error, could not find driver. Right, so let me see what PHP is looking at. Looks like PHP is not reading that configuration file. So I'm going to create an index.php. I'm gonna put some HTML here and call the PHP info method. Right, I just want to see what configuration file PHP is reading from, so that way I can change it. Looks like it's not reading from that PHP any dash development. So I'm gonna write a PHP script, PHP info, and then semicolon. All right, so let's save this and open it in the browser. So I'm gonna go to Chrome, localhost 3000, and then it should open the index.php. So let's see, configuration file, PHP any path, no value, loaded configuration file, none. So it looks like PHP has no idea where the configuration file is. All right, that's very strange. So let me go to PHP command line and point PHP to that configuration file that it should use, right? So PHP - help, and let's look for what option we need to use to pass it that configuration file. It looks like -d -f parse and execute file. No, it looks like -c. Yeah, so we can give it a path to a directory or path to the PHP any file. All right, so we're going to use -c. So we use the same options to run the server. We're only going to add -c and then point to that configuration file. So C, PHP, you can use tab for autocomplete, and then PHP, was it PHP any, php.ini dash development, right? Tab, it will do the autocomplete, and this should do it. Right, so let's reload this, and now it's reading this configuration file. So now PHP knows what configuration file is it's using. So I don't need this anymore, the index.php. If I go here, I'm gonna send this, and let's hope for the 200. We're getting an error, uncode type error, can't perform bitwise rule. Looks like PHP create line number 27. So let's go to line number 27 and see what's wrong here. Oh, okay. So in line number 27, bitwise. Are we using bitwise operator? Oh, it's crashing line number 27 here. So let me see. Oh yeah, we're using a bitwise operator instead of the not operator. So replace that and send, and we got no, we got another one, PDO line number. So in our model, line number 55. All right, so let's go to line 55 in our model and see what's wrong there. Okay, so line prepare, so DB table here, and so we're binding the task, and then we're binding the parameter, but it's still complaining about undefined method. All right, let's say bin parameter, that's wrong. All right, so bind parameter. All right, so let's send it, and a to-do item was created. Yay, finally. All right, so it worked. So now if we run the select, we should see the do homework. All right, so we only had 3 prior, now 4. All right, cool. So we were able to post and create a new to-do list item. Now we can move on to the next ones, right? So let's do read. So we're going to be using the same structures up to instantiating a to-do object. So I'm going to be copying this into read1. Change post. Remember, for read1, we're going to send an HTTP GET request. So we send an HTTP GET request, and then here create a to-do list item. To-do object, sorry. We're going to read the request query parameter. Remember, we're going to pass the ID as a query parameter. So we're going to be using, we check here for is set for that query parameter. So we pass get, and then we give it the ID. All right, and then we're going to read the to-do by the ID. All right. So similarly here, if it wasn't passed, we're going to send 422. So I copy and paste that, and then I'm gonna say error missing required query parameter ID if it wasn't passed to me. All right, we need to set the ID on our to-do instant, right, the object. So we set it, and then we need to read, right? So now we can read the to-do details. So we're gonna say if to-do read1, and then we call the read1 on the model, right? Again, this is under models to-do.php. Here, as you see, if it was found by the ID, it will execute and then set and then return true, otherwise it returns false. So we will getting the result and convert that as into an array. So we're gonna pass ID to do get ID. So this will set it, the result. So we got it, and now we call the getters to access the values, right? So you're gonna set the ID, task, date added, and then done, all right, by calling all the getters. And then we need to encode it, right? Convert this object into JSON and return it to the caller. So JSON encode to this object result. All right, else if things were not found, we're going to return 404 not found, and then we're going to return an error message. And just make sure that the error message is basically in JSON, right? Error no such item, right? So let's format this file and run it in Postman, right? So we're going to run read1. So this was the post. We're gonna copy this, and it's already here. We need to pass an ID as a parameter, right? A query parameter. So let me look at my database. We have 13, 14, 15, 16. So I'm gonna look at 16, the last one we created. Do homework. Pass the ID as a query parameter and send an HTTP GET request, and ta-da, we got the to-do list details. Right? So that's how we get this for the read1 endpoint. Next is we can move on into the read all, where we turn the list of to-do lists. All right, so similarly, we'll be sending an HTTP GET request. And here we are going to read all the to-do items. So we call read all, and remember, read all is returning true. We need to return the list of to-do items. So we need to implement this. So to implement this, we need to fetch all the results in after executing this statement. All right. So instead of returning true, so we need to go through the results. All right, so here check that you're returning more than 1, so more than 0, and then we will return all the items. So we call fetch all, and then we need to pass association, right? So it's PDO fetch association, right? So that will basically map the IDs, the keys, the fields in the rows into the object. So ID, task, done, date added, all will be as keys in our object, right? So get a list of objects here, and now we check if it's empty, and if it's not empty, we will return the results to the client. So we call JSON encode, and if not, we will return a message that says no to-do items were found. All right. So that means there aren't that to-do items in our database. So return this, and let's send an HTTP GET request, test it, and it's working, right? So you got all the to-do list items that are not done. So next we need to do the update. So I'll be copying that headers, checking from the previous ones. So we'll be sending a put request. So the put, an HTTP put request, the method is put and not get. So we'll change this to put, and we will basically check. We get the HTTP put request JSON body that will include the to-do ID and done, right? So we need those two. So I'm going to get that checks in. So do JSON encode, read the body, file get contents, and then we pass PHP input, right? So let's check that data, and then data, if the ID was passed, and then done was passed in the body. If not passed, we're gonna return an error 422 and say missing required parameters in the JSON body. All right, so in echo JSON encode, pass the message error missing required parameters, ID and done in the JSON body. All right. Something is not clicking here. Check it later. For this data object. Or I guess I will just move on, and then we'll see the error when we set an HTTP put request, and they'll fix it later. So let's set the ID. So to the one that we received in the HTTP JSON body. So we set the ID and done, and now we need to update the to-do item. All right, so to do that, we need to call update on the model. So to do on that object, to do object, and then we call update. And then if it was successful, we will return a JSON that says the to-do list item was updated. So send a message. Right, so the to-do item was updated. All right, so this, if it wasn't updated, we're also going to send JSON that says it's not updated. So let's return here to see what is wrong here. So let me update the call mom to done. So move it from 0 to done. Go to Postman, send an HTTP post request with that ID. So the ID for that is 15, and let's mark it as done. Send, and as expected, it did not pass, so it failed. Let me go to update line 26. It says here. Let me take a look here. Oh, we're using HTTP. That should be PHP, so that should do it. Now we're getting an issue with the ID. So we did set the ID. It's complaining that it's not Oh, so JSON encode, not decode. So sorry, JSON decode. It has to be decoded, not encoded. So that was the fix. We're still getting 95. Let's check 95 into the model. So let's go to the model and go all the way to what line 95 and bind parameter. Oh yeah, so this has to be equal. All right, so this should do it. Yes, so the to-do item was updated. Cool. So if we select again, we should see that the one with number 15 was marked as done. Again, MySQL uses tiny integer for boolean. That's why you see 0, 1. So let's do the delete, the last one. So it will be exactly similar to the update. The only difference is the method is delete, and we don't need done. We only need the ID of the to-do list item, so we can delete it. All right, so let's set the delete and put delete. So we set the delete here and we call delete, and if it was deleted, we will return a message that says it was deleted. So let's send the request to delete the to-do list item by its ID. And it was deleted, right? We can double check in the database and we see that it was deleted. All right, so we did all the endpoints. Next, I want to make a client. So an client application in JavaScript that will use the fetch API to fetch things from this API, from the PHP API, REST API. So here's the HTML and the JavaScript that will send the HTTP request. Just be sure you place them all in the same directory, so they all have to be served from the same host and same port, so you don't run into CORS errors and these CORS errors. So this is the fetch all to do's that will send a request to read all, and we also have another one that will send a request to the post request to create, and put request to update, and delete request to the delete.php endpoints. All right, so I'll put a link to this in the description. Just again, be sure that you place them all in the same directory and you serve them with the same web server. All right, so in my case, I'm going to serve them using the PHP, the built-in PHP server. So they all will be served on localhost 3000. The only difference is the server is on /API and the client app is on /client-app. All right, so that way I don't need to run into any security issues. Again, course will require another video explaining how to set it up correctly. All right, so localhost 3000 and then -client app. This is the app, and this is how you add items and update and delete them. All right, so that's how you implement this REST API in PHP, and how you create a client that will consume this API in JavaScript. All right, so so we add one, and we can also add another one. So let's do buy groceries and add it. We can also update or delete. Let me just get rid of this annoying pop-up here. So we marked it as done and we deleted this. All right, so that's how you work with APIs in PHP. Thank you.